There is a quiet kind of story that unfolds not in moments, but across centuries. A story shaped not by sudden noise, but by slow and steady change. Tonight, we drift into that story. A story of a land we now call Europe. A land that was not always clearly defined, not always unified, and not always known by a single name. So gently settle in. Allow your breathing to slow, and imagine the soft turning of time itself. Long before borders were drawn, before cities rose in stone and glass, Europe was a vast and varied landscape. It was a place of forests that seemed endless, rivers that moved quietly through valleys, and mountains that stood like ancient watchers over the land. The air was often cool, sometimes misty, and the rhythm of life followed the changing seasons. In those distant times, there were no nations as we know them today. Instead, the land was home to scattered tribes, small groups of people who lived close to nature, guided by the cycles of the earth. They built simple homes from wood and earth, gathered food from the land, and moved with the changing weather. Each tribe had its own customs, its own stories, its own way of understanding the world. If you listen closely, you can almost imagine their lives. The soft crackle of a fire in the evening, the quiet murmur of voices sharing stories under the stars, the distant sound of wind moving through tall grasses. These early people did not think of themselves as part of something called Europe. That idea would come much later. For now, the land was simply their home, wild, beautiful, and ever-changing. Over time, these tribes began to grow. Some settled more permanently, choosing fertile lands near rivers where crops could be grown. Others continued to move, following animals or seeking new places to live. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, patterns began to form. Paths became trails, trails became routes, and routes began to connect distant groups. With these connections came something new: exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas. Tools improved, stories spread, beliefs began to shift and blend. And in this quiet exchange, the earliest threads of a shared history were woven. Yet the land itself still held many divisions. Thick forests separated one group from another. Mountains created natural boundaries. Rivers, though life-giving, could also divide. Travel was slow, and the unknown often lay just beyond the horizon. And still, time continued its gentle movement. In the southern reaches of this land, near the warm waters of the Mediterranean, something different began to stir. Here, the climate was milder, the land more open. Early settlements began to grow into something more structured, more permanent. These would one day become the seeds of powerful civilizations. But for now, the rest of Europe remained a patchwork of cultures, a quiet mosaic of tribes and small communities. There was no single ruler, no unified language, no shared identity across the entire land. And yet, something subtle was happening. Across centuries, people began to settle more deeply into the land. They cleared forests to create fields. They built stronger shelters. They began to form bonds not just within tribes, but between them. Alliances, however fragile, started to appear. These were the earliest steps towards something larger. The land itself seemed to guide this slow transformation. Rivers became natural pathways for travel and trade. Valleys offered protection and resources. Hills and high grounds provided safety from unseen dangers. And in these bases, small centers of life began to grow. Not cities, not yet, but places where people gathered more often, where traditions deepened, where the idea of belonging began to extend beyond a single tribe. If you imagine drifting above this ancient landscape, you would see small pockets of light scattered across a vast, dark wilderness, each one representing a group of people, each one carrying its own quiet story. And though they did not yet know it, these scattered lights would one day connect. They would become kingdoms. They would shape empires. They would give rise to a continent that would influence the entire world. But for now, everything remains still and slow. The forests whisper, the rivers flow. The people live their quiet lives, unaware of the centuries of change that lie ahead. And as we continue this gentle journey, we begin to see how these small beginnings slowly, almost invisibly, start to take form. The first hints of kingdoms are not far away. As time continues its slow and steady passage, those scattered pockets of life begin to settle more deeply into the land. The forests, once untouched and endless, are gently shaped by human hands. Clearings grow wider, fields stretch a little farther, and the rhythm of life begins to shift from wandering to staying. It happens so gradually that no one notices the moment it begins. Families remain in one place for longer seasons, then for years, and eventually for generations. The land becomes more than a temporary shelter. It becomes something familiar, something known, a place where memories gather like soft layers of time. With this quiet settling comes a subtle change in how people see themselves. No longer only members of a moving tribe, they begin to belong to a place, a valley, a riverbank, a stretch of fertile ground. These places take on meaning. They are defended, cared for, remembered. And from this sense of place, the earliest roots of kingdoms begin to grow. At first, leadership is simple. A respected elder, a skilled hunter, a wise voice in times of uncertainty. But as communities grow larger, decisions become more complex. Disputes must be settled. Resources must be shared. Protection becomes more important. Slowly, leadership becomes more defined. Certain individuals rise not just because of strength, but because of trust. They guide their people through harsh winters, through poor harvests, through uncertain times. And over generations, these roles begin to solidify. Leadership becomes inheritance. The idea of a ruler begins to take shape, not as a distant figure of power, but as a central presence within a growing community. And with this, something new quietly emerges: identity. Groups begin to see themselves not just as people who live together, but as people who belong together. They share customs, language, stories, and beliefs that set them apart from others. These differences are not yet barriers, but they are beginnings. Across the land, many such groups begin to form. In the western regions, near the edges of the great ocean, communities develop along rugged coastlines and green hills. In the central lands, dense forests still dominate, but clearings grow larger and more permanent. In the east, wide plains stretch outward, where movement remains easier, and cultures continue to blend. And in the south, near the Mediterranean, settlements grow more quickly, shaped by warmer climates and easier travel across the sea. Each region begins to develop its own rhythm, its own way of life. Yet, even as these differences grow, connections deepen. Trade becomes more common. Simple goods, tools, food, crafted items, move from one community to another. With them travel ideas, traditions, and ways of thinking. Slowly, the boundaries between groups soften, even as identities become stronger. It is a quiet balance. And in this balance, the first true kingdoms begin to appear. They are small by modern standards, often no more than a cluster of settlements under a single leader. Their borders are not marked by lines on a map, but by natural features, rivers, hills, forests. And their power is not absolute. A ruler depends on the loyalty of their people, on alliances with neighboring groups, on the ability to provide stability in an unpredictable world. Life within these early kingdoms is still simple. Days are shaped by the rising and setting of the sun. Work follows the seasons, planting, tending, harvesting. Evenings bring quiet gatherings, shared meals, and stories passed from one voice to another. There is a sense of closeness, of community, of life moving at a gentle pace. And yet, beneath this calm surface, change continues. As kingdoms grow, so too does the need to protect them. Small conflicts begin to arise. Over land, over resources, over boundaries that are not always clear. These conflicts are not yet the great wars of later centuries, but they plant the earliest seeds of competition. Some kingdoms expand, others fade. Some merge through alliances or shared leadership. Others are absorbed quietly, their identities blending into something new. Nothing is fixed. Everything shifts, slowly and steadily. And through these shifts, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Across the vast and varied land, there is now a sense, still faint, still forming, that these many small kingdoms are part of something greater. Not yet a single entity, not yet unified, but connected by trade, by movement, by shared experiences across generations. The idea of Europe, though still unnamed, begins to take its earliest shape, not as a place defined by borders, but as a network of lives, cultures, and histories slowly weaving together. If you imagine once more drifting above this landscape, the scattered lights you saw before now appear closer, more numerous, more connected. Paths between them glow faintly. Voices travel farther, and the quiet beginnings of something enduring start to take hold. As time continues its gentle flow, these early kingdoms will grow stronger, more complex, and eventually they will give rise to something even larger. The age of empires is slowly approaching. As the centuries continue their quiet unfolding, the small kingdoms that once stood alone begin to change in subtle but meaningful ways. What were once clusters of settlements guided by local rulers now start to reach beyond their immediate surroundings. The land, once divided into countless small worlds, begins to feel slightly smaller. Paths that were once narrow and uncertain become more traveled. Traders move more confidently between regions. Messages, carried by foot or by horse, travel farther than before. And with this growing movement comes a quiet expansion of awareness. People begin to understand that there are other lands beyond their own, other rulers, other ways of life. And from this awareness, something begins to shift. Some kingdoms, through careful leadership or fortunate geography, grow stronger than others. They gather more land, form more alliances, and extend their influence beyond their original borders. At first, this growth is gentle, an agreement here, a shared protection there. But over time, these growing kingdoms begin to take on a new shape. They become early empires. An empire does not appear all at once. It forms slowly, like a tree spreading its branches. Each new territory adds to its reach. Each new group of people brings different customs, different languages, different traditions. And so, these early empires become places of quiet diversity, woven together not by sameness, but by connection. In the southern regions of Europe, especially around the Mediterranean, this transformation becomes most visible. The sea itself acts as a bridge rather than a barrier. Ships glide across its surface, carrying goods, ideas, and people from one shore to another. Along these coasts, settlements grow into cities, not hurriedly, but steadily. Stone replaces wood. Structures rise with intention. Markets become centers of daily life. And within these growing cities, knowledge begins to gather. Writing becomes more common. Records are kept. Laws begin to take shape, not just as spoken traditions, but as something more enduring. There is a quiet sense of order emerging. Further north and west, the transformation is slower, but no less important. The forests are still deep, the lands still rugged, but even here, the influence of growing powers begins to reach. Trade routes stretch farther. Ideas flow outward from the south, carried by merchants and travelers. New tools, new methods of building, new ways of organizing society begin to appear. It is not a sudden change. It is a gentle spreading. And within this spreading influence, the idea of connection deepens. Empires bring with them a kind of unity, not complete, not perfect, but noticeable. Under a single authority, different regions begin to share certain systems. Roads are built to link distant areas. Communication becomes more reliable. A sense of belonging to something larger starts to take hold. Yet, even as these empires grow, they remain fragile. Their strength depends on balance, between control and cooperation, between expansion and stability. Too much force can create resistance. Too little unity can lead to fragmentation. And so, they move carefully, often without realizing it. Across Europe, the presence of these early empires begins to reshape the land. Borders, though still fluid, become more meaningful. Leadership becomes more structured. The role of rulers grows more defined, not just as protectors, but as organizers of vast and varied territories. Life for ordinary people changes slowly within this new structure. In some places, there is greater stability. Roads make travel easier. Markets offer more variety. There is a sense of connection to distant places, even if those places are never seen. In other areas, the changes are quieter. Traditions remain strong. Local customs continue. The influence of the empire is felt, but not always deeply. And throughout it all, time continues its steady, unhurried movement. Empires rise not with sudden force, but with gradual accumulation. And just as gently, they begin to face challenges. Distance makes control difficult. Differences between regions create quiet tensions. Leadership changes, and with it, direction shifts. Nothing remains still. Some empires expand further, reaching across wide stretches of land. Others begin to soften at the edges, their influence slowly fading. In some places, new powers begin to emerge from within, reshaping the structure from the inside. It is a continuous cycle. Growth, connection, transformation, and beneath it all, the land of Europe continues to evolve. If you return once more to that quiet view from above, the scattered lights of earlier times have now formed clusters, larger, brighter, more connected. Lines of movement stretch between them like gentle threads. The continent is no longer a collection of isolated places. It is becoming something more unified, more complex, more alive with shared history. And as these early empires continue to shape the land, a new chapter begins to form. A chapter of castles, of fortified towns, of life lived within walls and fields. The slow, steady world of medieval Europe is beginning to emerge. Section 4. As the great shapes of early empires begin to soften and shift, Europe enters a quieter, more enclosed chapter of its story. The wide-reaching connections of earlier times do not disappear, but they become less visible, settling into slower rhythms, closer to the land. The world feels smaller again, more local, more rooted. Across the continent, life gathers around places of shelter and safety. Where once open land stretched between scattered communities, there now rise structures built not only for living, but for protection. Castles begin to appear. At first, they are simple. Wooden fortifications set upon hills, overlooking valleys and rivers. Over time, they grow stronger. Stone replaces timber. Walls become thicker. Towers rise higher, watching quietly over the surrounding land. These castles are not just homes. They are centers of life. Around them, villages begin to form. Small clusters of homes where people live and work. Their days shaped by the presence of the castle above. Fields spread outward, carefully tended. Paths wind between homes, wells, and gathering places. Life becomes deeply tied to place once more. This is the beginning of what we now call medieval Europe, though those living within it would simply know it as their everyday world. The pace of life is slow and steady. Mornings begin with the soft light of dawn, as people step into fields, workshops, and simple routines. There is comfort in repetition, in knowing what each day will bring. Seasons guide everything. Spring brings planting, summer brings growth, autumn brings harvest, winter brings rest, reflection, and quiet gatherings indoors. The passing of time is not marked by calendars, but by the feel of the air, the color of the land, the position of the sun. Within this rhythm, a structure of society gently takes shape. At the center stands the lord or ruler of the castle, responsible for the protection of the land and the people who live upon it. In return, those people offer their labor, their loyalty, their presence. It is a relationship built not on distant authority, but on proximity. People know their rulers, they see them, they live under their watch, and often under their care. This system spreads across much of Europe, creating a pattern that feels both stable and contained. Each region becomes its own small world, connected loosely to others, but deeply rooted in its own traditions. And within these worlds, life continues quietly. Markets gather on certain days, bringing together people from nearby villages. Goods are exchanged, grain, cloth, tools, simple crafts. Voices mingle, stories are shared. There is a gentle sense of connection, even within this localized life. Faith, too, begins to play a more central role. Across Europe, places of worship rise slowly, small at first, then larger, built from stone with care and intention. These spaces offer not only spiritual guidance, but also a sense of unity. They become places where people gather, reflect, and find meaning beyond the routines of daily life. The sound of bells carries softly across fields and hills, marking time in a way that feels both grounding and timeless. And yet, even within this calm and ordered world, change continues its quiet work. Kingdoms, though smaller in reach than earlier empires, begin to strengthen their identities. Borders, still not sharply defined, become more recognized. Rulers seek to extend their influence, sometimes through alliances, sometimes through gentle expansion. Conflicts do arise, but they are often brief, limited in scale, and woven into the ongoing rhythm of life. They do not yet dominate the story. Instead, they pass like distant storms, felt but not overwhelming. What matters most in this time is continuity. Generations live and pass within the same landscapes. Traditions are handed down without haste. Buildings stand for decades, even centuries, becoming part of the memory of the land itself. There is a sense of endurance, of a world that, though changing slowly, feels steady beneath one's feet. If you imagine once more drifting above Europe, the view has changed again. The clusters of life are now anchored by strongholds, castles standing like quiet guardians. Around them, the land is carefully shaped, fields arranged in soft patterns, villages nestled close. The movement between places is still present, but slower, more deliberate, and within this stillness, something deeper begins to form, a growing awareness of belonging, not just to a village or lord, but to a kingdom, to a wider identity that stretches just beyond the horizon. It is subtle, almost unspoken, but it is there. And as time continues to flow, these quiet worlds will begin to shift once more. Boundaries will stretch, power will move, connections will grow beyond the walls of castles and the edges of fields. The balance of this peaceful order will begin, slowly, to change. Section 5. As the steady rhythms of medieval life continue, something almost imperceptible begins to shift beneath the surface of Europe's quiet landscapes. The castles still stand, the fields are still tended, and the seasons move as they always have. But within and between these settled worlds, a gentle tension begins to grow. It is not loud. It does not arrive all at once. It moves slowly, like a change in the wind that is felt before it is seen. The kingdoms that formed around castles and communities have, over time, grown more aware of one another. What were once distant neighbors are now closer, more connected, and more conscious of shared boundaries. And with that awareness comes a natural question. Where does one kingdom end and another begin? At first, these questions are answered quietly, through agreements, through marriages that unite families and lands, through spoken promises made between rulers who seek balance rather than conflict. Borders remain fluid, shifting gently with circumstance, guided more by understanding than by force. But as generations pass, these boundaries begin to matter more. Land is no longer just a place to live. It becomes something to define, to hold, to pass down. Rivers, hills, and forests, once simple features of the landscape, now take on new meaning. They mark edges, they separate, they belong. And so, across Europe, rulers begin to look beyond their own lands with growing interest. Some see opportunity in neighboring territories, fertile fields, well-placed towns, or valuable routes that connect distant regions. Others seek security, hoping to create stronger borders that protect their people from uncertainty. These desires do not immediately lead to great upheaval. Instead, they create a quiet pattern of movement. A village changes hands after a peaceful agreement. A region becomes part of a larger kingdom through a family union. A small territory is absorbed into a neighboring land, not through sudden force, but through gradual influence. The map of Europe, though not yet drawn in clear lines, begins to shift. It is a slow rearranging, like pieces gently sliding into new positions. Within these changes, the role of rulers becomes more complex. No longer simply guardians of a single region, they begin to act as negotiators, planners, and careful observers of the world beyond their immediate reach. They must balance strength with patience. Too much expansion risks resistance. Too little leaves them vulnerable. And so, power moves quietly, not always through battle, but through presence, through alliances, through the steady extension of influence. For the people living within these kingdoms, life continues much as before. Fields are still planted, homes are still built and repaired, Families gather, seasons pass, and traditions endure. Yet, there is a subtle awareness that things are changing. A new ruler may arrive, bringing slightly different customs. A neighboring village may now belong to a different kingdom. Travelers carry stories of distant lands where similar changes are unfolding. The world feels just a little less fixed. And in this gentle uncertainty, connections between regions grow stronger. Trade routes become more defined. Paths between towns are used more often. Markets expand, offering goods from farther away. With each exchange, the sense of a wider world deepens. People begin to understand that they are part of something larger. Not just their village or their kingdom, but a network of lands and lives stretching across the continent. It is still a quiet realization, but it is growing. At the same time, centers of influence begin to emerge more clearly. Certain cities, often near rivers or crossroads, grow larger and more active. They become places where ideas gather, where decisions are made, where the future is shaped in subtle ways. These are not yet the great cities of later centuries, but they are beginnings. Places where the movement of Europe can be felt more strongly. And as these centers grow, so too does the complexity of the continent itself. No longer a simple collection of isolated kingdoms, Europe is becoming a living, shifting landscape of relationships between rulers, between regions, between people. It is a delicate balance, and like all balances, it cannot remain unchanged forever. Across the land, the quiet negotiations and shifting borders begin slowly to give way to something more defined. The stakes grow higher. The desire for control becomes stronger. The connections between kingdoms, once gentle and cooperative, begin to carry hints of tension, still calm, still measured, but changing. If you imagine once more that view from above, the clusters of life are now linked by clearer paths, and the spaces between them feel smaller. The land is no longer still. It is gently in motion. And within that motion, the next chapter begins to take shape. A chapter where the quiet shifts of power will, over time, lead to moments that echo more strongly across the land. The shaping of Europe through conflict is slowly approaching, though even this will unfold with the same steady rhythm of time. Section 6. As Europe continues its long and unhurried transformation, the quiet shifts of earlier centuries begin to gather weight. The gentle movement of borders, the careful balance between kingdoms, and the slow expansion of influence all begin to lead, almost naturally, toward moments of conflict. But even now, these conflicts do not arrive as sudden storms. They emerge gradually, like distant clouds forming on the horizon. At first, disagreements between kingdoms remain small. A disputed piece of land, a question of loyalty, a broken agreement between rulers. These moments are often resolved through negotiation or through brief and contained encounters. Yet, over time, something changes. The kingdoms themselves have grown stronger, more organized, more aware of their place within the wider landscape of Europe. Rulers begin to think not only of protection, but of legacy, of what they will leave behind, of how their lands will endure. And with this deeper sense of purpose comes a stronger desire to hold, to expand, and sometimes to challenge. Still, the pace remains slow. When conflicts do arise, they are often limited in scope. Small groups of soldiers move across fields and hills, guided by their leaders. Encounters are brief, sometimes more symbolic than destructive. The land, vast and patient, absorbs these moments without losing its quiet rhythm. Villages continue their routines. Fields are planted and harvested. Life does not stop. It simply adjusts. And yet, these small conflicts begin to leave traces. They shape alliances. They influence decisions. They create memories that linger in the minds of rulers and communities alike. Over generations, these memories build, forming a deeper awareness of difference, of us and them. This awareness is still soft, not yet hardened into division, but it is growing. Across Europe, certain regions begin to experience more frequent tensions. Borderlands, those places where kingdoms meet, become areas of quiet uncertainty. Control shifts back and forth, sometimes through agreement, sometimes through force. People living in these regions learn to adapt. They live between identities, between rulers, between changing expectations. Their lives reflect the fluid nature of the land itself. At the same time, larger patterns begin to emerge. Some kingdoms, through careful leadership and steady growth, become more influential. Their voices carry farther. Their decisions affect not just their own lands, but those around them. These growing powers begin to shape the balance of Europe more noticeably. And as they do, the scale of conflict begins slowly to expand, not all at once, not with overwhelming force, but with a gradual increase in complexity. Conflicts now involve not just neighboring villages or small territories, but wider regions. Alliances form between kingdoms, linking distant lands together in shared purpose. A disagreement in one place can ripple outward, touching others far beyond its origin. The web of Europe tightens, and within this web, every movement matters. Still, even in these moments, the tone remains measured. There are no sudden transformations, no instant upheavals. Instead, there is a sense of unfolding, of events moving forward with the steady rhythm that has always guided this land. For the people who lived through these times, life continues to be grounded in the familiar. The work of the land, the care of family, the passing of seasons, all remain constant. And perhaps it is this constancy that allows Europe to absorb these changes without losing its sense of continuity. Even as conflicts shape the land, they do so gently over time. They redefine borders, they influence leadership, they alter relationships between kingdoms, but they do not erase what came before. Instead, they become part of the ongoing story, a story of gradual change, of quiet transformation, of a continent slowly finding its shape. If you imagine once more that calm view from above, the movement across the land is now more noticeable. Paths are more traveled. Regions are more defined. The connections between kingdoms are stronger, but also more complex. There is a sense that the land is preparing for something larger, not a single moment, but a series of changes that will continue to shape its future. And as these early conflicts settle into the fabric of Europe, a new direction begins to emerge. The attention of this growing continent will soon turn outward, beyond its familiar landscapes, beyond its forests and fields, toward distant horizons. The age of expansion is quietly approaching. As Europe settles into the patterns shaped by its kingdoms and quiet conflicts, a subtle shift begins to draw its attention outward. The land, once the center of all movement and thought, no longer feels quite as contained. Beyond its edges, past the forests, beyond the mountains, across the wide and gently moving seas, there is a growing sense of curiosity. It is not urgency that guides this change, but wonder. For generations, people had lived within the familiar rhythms of their regions. Yet now, Through trade, travel, and the steady exchange of ideas, stories of distant places begin to reach more ears. These stories are soft at first, whispers of lands where the sun feels warmer, where goods are different, where the world stretches far beyond what is known. And slowly, that whisper becomes an invitation. In the southern parts of Europe, near the Mediterranean, this invitation is felt most clearly. The sea, which had long connected nearby lands, begins to feel like a pathway to something much greater. Ships, once used mainly for local trade, begin to travel farther. Their journeys grow longer, their routes more ambitious. The horizon no longer marks an end, but a beginning. Craftsmen refine their skills in building stronger vessels. Knowledge of winds and currents becomes more detailed, passed carefully from one generation to the next. Navigation, though still uncertain, improves with time and patience. Each voyage adds a little more understanding. Each return brings back not only goods, but stories of coastlines never seen before, of cultures that feel both unfamiliar and strangely connected. Across Europe, these stories begin to spread. They reach the growing cities, the quiet villages, the halls of rulers, and the gatherings of traders. And with each telling, the idea of the wider world becomes more real. Rulers too begin to take notice. The desire to understand what lies beyond their lands is joined by something else, a quiet recognition that these distant places may hold value, not only in goods, but in opportunity, in connection, in influence. And so, support for these journeys grows, not as a sudden decision, but as a gradual shift in focus. Ships are prepared with greater care. Voyages are planned with more intention. Those who travel are no longer simply traders or wanderers. They become explorers, though they may not yet think of themselves in that way. They are guided by curiosity and by the steady encouragement of those who see potential in the unknown. Across the continent, the energy of Europe begins to stretch outward. It is still rooted in its lands, its kingdoms, its traditions. But now there is a second movement, a gentle reaching beyond. For the people who remain behind, life continues in its familiar rhythm. Fields are tended, markets gather, communities remain close-knit and steady. And yet, there is a growing awareness that something is changing, a sense that Europe is no longer only looking inward, but beginning to engage with a much larger world. The ships that leave its shores carry more than goods. They carry pieces of Europe itself, its ideas, its customs, its ways of understanding life. And when they return, they bring back new influences that begin, slowly, to blend with what already exists. It is a quiet exchange, but a powerful one. The edges of Europe are softening, not in the sense of losing identity, but in becoming more connected, more aware of its place within something vast and interconnected. If you imagine once more that peaceful view from above, the land of Europe now feels both grounded and in motion. The familiar clusters of life remain, but from the southern coasts, delicate lines extend outward across the water. Ships move slowly along these paths, like threads being woven into a much larger tapestry. And as these threads extend farther and farther, they begin to shape a new chapter in Europe's story. A chapter where the continent does not only grow within itself, but begins to influence the world beyond. The age of exploration is unfolding gently, and with it, the beginnings of a wider, more connected history. Section 8. As Europe's gaze continues to drift beyond its own horizons, The gentle curiosity of earlier journeys begins to settle into something more lasting. What once were occasional voyages across uncertain waters slowly become regular paths, routes traced again and again, until they feel almost familiar. The sea, once vast and unknown, begins to feel like a quiet bridge between worlds. Ships leave the shores of Europe not just to explore, but to return. And with each return, knowledge deepens. Maps, once simple and incomplete, begin to take clearer shape. Coastlines are remembered. Winds are understood. Distances, though still great, become less mysterious. And within this growing understanding, a new pattern begins to form. Europe does not only reach outward, it begins gently to settle beyond itself. At first, these distant places are simply stops along long journeys, safe harbours, points of rest, small outposts where travellers can gather supplies, exchange goods, and prepare for the next part of their voyage. But over time, these outposts begin to grow. Structures are built. Communities, though small, begin to take root. People from Europe stay longer, sometimes for seasons, sometimes for years. They bring with them their customs, their languages, their ways of life. And slowly, these distant lands begin to feel connected to Europe, not as extensions of its kingdoms just yet, but as distant echoes of its presence. This is the quiet beginning of colonial expansion. It does not arrive all at once, nor does it feel overwhelming at first. It unfolds gradually, shaped by countless small decisions, individual journeys, and the steady encouragement of those who see possibility in distance. Trade plays a central role in this transformation. Goods that were once rare begin to appear more often. Materials from distant lands, spices, fabrics, metals, find their way into European markets. They are unfamiliar, sometimes mysterious, and they carry with them the sense of places far beyond the known world. Markets grow more diverse. Cities, especially those along the coasts, become centers of exchange, not just of goods, but of ideas and experiences. The world begins to feel larger, but also more connected. For the people of Europe, this connection brings both change and continuity. Daily life still follows the rhythm of the seasons. Fields are still planted. Homes are still built with care. But alongside these familiar patterns, new influences quietly take root. New tastes, new materials, new stories, and with them, a subtle shift in perspective. Europe is no longer simply a collection of kingdoms within a shared land. It is becoming a part of a wider, interconnected world. Rulers, observing these changes, begin to take a more active role. What began as individual journeys now becomes something more organized. Support for distant settlements grows. Efforts are made to strengthen these far-reaching connections. The idea of holding influence beyond the continent itself begins to take shape. Yet, even as this expansion continues, it retains its slow and measured character. There are no sudden transformations, no single moment where everything changes. Instead, there is a steady unfolding. A port becomes a town becomes a small colony. Connections deepen, routes become more reliable. And over generations, these distant places become woven into the broader fabric of European life. Back within Europe, the effects of this outward movement begin to gather. Wealth, though unevenly distributed, increases in certain regions. Cities grow larger, more active, more layered with complexity. The quiet medieval world begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift into something new, still calm, still grounded, but changing. If you imagine once more that gentle view from above, Europe now appears not only as a network of lands, but as the center of extending lines, reaching outward across seas, touching distant shores, forming connections that stretch far beyond its original boundaries. It is no longer contained. It is expanding, slowly, thoughtfully, like ripples moving outward across still water. And as these ripples continue to spread, they begin to reshape not only distant lands, but Europe itself. A new kind of transformation is approaching, one that will unfold not across oceans, but within the very structure of daily life. The quiet beginnings of industry, of change within the land itself, are slowly drawing near. Section 9. As Europe's connections to distant lands continue to stretch outward, another transformation begins to unfold quietly within its own borders. It does not arrive from across the sea, nor does it emerge from the shifting of kingdoms. Instead, it grows slowly from within, shaped by new ways of thinking, new methods of working, and a gradual reimagining of daily life. At first, the change is almost invisible. Villages remain where they have always been. Fields are still cultivated with care. The rhythm of the seasons continues to guide the lives of many, and yet, in certain places, often near rivers or growing towns, something begins to feel different. Work, once tied closely to the land, starts to gather indoors. Small workshops appear, where individuals focus not on farming, but on crafting. Cloth is woven more efficiently. Tools are shaped with greater precision. Objects that once took long hours to create are now made a little faster, a little more consistently. These are quiet beginnings, but they carry within them the seeds of something much larger. Over time, these workshops grow. They bring together more people under one roof, working not just independently, but as part of a shared effort. Tasks become more specialized. One person spins thread, another weaves, another finishes the final product. There is a new rhythm emerging, not guided by sunlight alone, but by the steady pace of work itself. And from this rhythm, a subtle transformation begins. In certain towns, these workshops expand into larger spaces. Early factories, though they may not yet be called by that name, they are places of movement and sound, where tools operate in repeated patterns, and where the focus shifts from individual creation to collective production. It is not a sudden shift away from the land, but a gradual addition to it. Fields still matter, harvests still define the year, but alongside them, a new kind of activity grows, one that is less dependent on the seasons and more shaped by human design. Rivers play a quiet but important role in this change. Their steady flow, once valued mainly for irrigation and transport, begins to serve another purpose. Water becomes a source of energy, turning simple mechanisms that help power tools and processes. It is a gentle partnership between nature and innovation. And as this partnership deepens, the scale of production begins to grow. Goods that were once rare become more common. Cloth, tools, and other crafted items can now be made in greater quantities. Markets expand. Trade becomes more active, not just between nearby regions, but across wider distances. Cities begin to grow more quickly. What were once modest towns become centers of activity. People move toward them, drawn by opportunity, by the promise of work, by the sense that something new is unfolding there. Life in these growing cities carries a different rhythm. Days are shaped not only by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the steady continuation of work. Streets become more active. Buildings rise closer together. The quiet space of the countryside gives way in these places to a gentle hum of constant movement. And yet, even here the tone remains calm. This is not a sudden upheaval. It is a slow transformation, one that unfolds over generations, allowing people to adjust, to adapt, to find their place within the changing world. Back in the countryside, life continues much as it always has. The connection to the land remains strong, and many choose to stay within its familiar rhythms. But even here, the influence of change can be felt. Tools improve, methods of farming evolve, knowledge spreads more easily between regions. The distance between different ways of life begins slowly to narrow. Europe is becoming more connected, not just across its lands, but within its daily experience. If you imagine once more that quiet view from above, the continent now holds a new kind of pattern. Alongside the familiar fields and villages, there are growing clusters of activity, towns expanding, cities becoming more defined, movement increasing along roads and rivers. The land itself feels more alive with motion, and within this motion, the foundation of a new era is taking shape. An era where the balance between land and industry, between tradition and innovation, will continue to evolve, where the structure of society will slowly shift, giving rise to new identities, new roles, and new ways of understanding what it means to belong. The quiet world of kingdoms and fields is not disappearing. It is simply changing, becoming something more layered, more complex, more connected. And as this transformation continues, the outlines of modern nations begin gently to emerge from the past. Section 10. As the steady transformation of daily life continues, the shape of Europe begins to change in a deeper and more lasting way. The growing towns, the expanding trade, and the quiet rise of industry all begin to influence something more abstract, yet more powerful: the idea of belonging. For centuries, people had identified themselves through local ties, by their village, their region, their ruler. But now, as connections stretch farther and communication becomes more consistent, a broader sense of identity begins to take form. It is still gentle, still evolving, but it is there. Across the continent, kingdoms that once felt separate and distant begin to define themselves more clearly. Their borders, though still shifting at times, become more recognized. Their languages, once varied even within small areas, begin to settle into more common forms. And with this comes a quiet realization. People are not only part of a place, they are part of something larger, a nation. This idea does not appear all at once. It grows slowly, shaped by shared experiences, by collective memory, by the gradual weaving together of communities over time. Stories begin to matter more. Not just the small stories of villages and families, but the wider stories of entire lands, of where people came from, of what they have lived through, of what connects them across distance. These stories are told and retold, carried through generations, until they begin to form a sense of unity that stretches beyond local life. Rulers, too, begin to see their lands differently. No longer simply territories to manage, they become realms to define, places with identity, with continuity, with a shared sense of purpose. Efforts are made to strengthen this unity, to bring different regions under a more consistent structure. Laws become more standardized. Systems of governance grow more organized. Communication between distant parts of a kingdom becomes more reliable. And slowly, the idea of a modern nation begins to take shape. It is not yet complete. There are still differences, still variations, still places where older ways remain strong. But the direction is clear. Europe is becoming a continent of nations. At the same time, the changes brought by industry continue to deepen. Cities grow larger, drawing people from many regions into shared spaces. Within these cities, different accents, traditions, and experiences come together. This blending further strengthens the sense of a wider identity. People who may never have left their village in earlier centuries now find themselves living among others from distant parts of the same land. They share work, space, and daily routines. Over time, these shared experiences create new connections. The idea of we expands. And yet, even as this sense of unity grows, the diversity of Europe remains. Each nation develops its own character, shaped by its history, its landscape, its people. Languages differ. Traditions remain unique. Ways of life, though increasingly connected, still carry the imprint of the past. It is a quiet balance between unity and individuality. Across the continent, this balance shapes the emergence of modern Europe. If you imagine once more that calm view from above, the land now appears more defined. The clusters of life have grown into larger, more structured forms. The spaces between them are filled with movement, roads, trade routes, lines of communication that connect distant places. Borders, though still evolving, begin to hold more meaning. They are no longer just natural divisions, but expressions of identity, of shared culture, shared history, shared belonging. And within these borders, life continues to flow. Cities hum gently with activity. Countryside remains steady and rooted. The old and the new exist side by side, each shaping the other in quiet ways. This is a time of becoming, not sudden, not complete, but steady. And as Europe continues along this path, the growing nations will soon face moments that test their strength, their unity, and their place within the wider world. Moments that will leave lasting marks, but will also lead, in time, to reflection, rebuilding, and a deeper understanding of connection. The story moves forward, always gently, always shaped by time. Section 11. As the nations of Europe continue to take shape, the quiet sense of identity that has been growing over centuries begins to deepen. Borders feel more real, languages more defined. Connections within each nation become stronger, more familiar. And yet, across the continent, there is also a growing awareness of something beyond these borders, a sense that each nation, while distinct, exists alongside others, close enough to touch, close enough to influence, and sometimes close enough to challenge. At first, this awareness is calm. Nations interact through trade, through shared ideas, through cultural exchange. People travel more freely than before. Knowledge moves across borders, carried by books, conversations, and quiet curiosity. Europe feels connected, but also gently divided. Each nation holds its own identity, its own path, its own understanding of the world. And within this balance, a tension begins to form, not sharp or immediate, but slow and gathering. It is the natural result of closeness, of many strong identities existing side by side. Over time, these tensions begin to surface in small ways. Disagreements between nations, like those once seen between kingdoms, arise over borders, influence, and direction. Alliances form, agreements of support and cooperation between nations that share interests or perspectives. These alliances create a delicate web across Europe, a web that connects distant places. but also means that a shift in one part of the continent can be felt far away. Still, life for most people continues in its steady rhythm. Cities grow larger, filled with movement and quiet purpose. Industry continues to shape daily life. The countryside remains grounded in its familiar patterns. Families live, work and rest much as they always have. The larger tensions, though present, remain in the background, until slowly they begin to move forward. Conflicts between nations, once limited and contained, begin to involve more participants. Alliances draw in multiple regions. What begins as a disagreement between a few can extend outward, touching many. The scale changes, but the tone of time remains the same. Even in these moments, Europe does not transform all at once. Events unfold gradually, shaped by decisions, by movements, by the quiet accumulation of actions over time. For those living through these periods, the experience is complex. There are moments of uncertainty, of change, of adjustment, and yet there is also continuity. Life does not stop. It adapts. Communities support one another. Daily routines, though altered, continue to provide structure and meaning. And when these periods of conflict pass, as they always do, something else begins. Reflection, rebuilding, a gentle return to balance. Across Europe, nations begin to look not only inward, but toward each other with a new perspective. The closeness that once created tension now offers the possibility of understanding. The shared history, long, layered, and deeply interconnected, becomes more visible. People begin to see that, despite differences, there are many threads that bind them together. Trade resumes, travel continues, ideas flow once more across borders, and within this renewed connection, there is a quiet desire for stability, for a way of existing together that preserves identity while reducing division. It is not an immediate solution. It is a gradual process, one shaped by time, by experience, by the slow realization that the strength of Europe lies not only in its individual nations, but in the connections between them. If you imagine once more that peaceful view from above, the continent now appears both structured and fluid. Nations are clearly formed, yet the lines between them are crossed by countless paths, roads, railways, and routes of communication that bind them together. The movement across Europe feels constant, yet calm. And within this movement, a new chapter begins to emerge. A chapter of rebuilding, of cooperation, of quiet steps toward unity. The modern shape of Europe is beginning to come into view. Section 12. As the echoes of earlier tensions begin to soften, Europe enters a quieter period of reflection and renewal. The continent, shaped by centuries of slow transformation, now turns gently toward a new kind of future, one not defined solely by borders or differences, but by the possibility of connection. This shift does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds, as everything in Europe has, over time. Nations, once focused mainly on their own paths, begin to look toward one another with a different kind of awareness. The shared experiences of the past, both calm and uncertain, create a foundation for something new, a quiet understanding that despite many differences, there is a common thread running through the continent. This thread is not always visible, but it is felt in the movement of people across borders, in the exchange of ideas, in the recognition of familiar patterns in distant places. Gradually, efforts begin to emerge, small at first, then more defined, to strengthen these connections. Cooperation becomes a guiding idea, not as a replacement for identity, but as a way to preserve it, while reducing the weight of division. Nations begin to find ways to work together, sharing resources, building agreements, and creating systems that allow for smoother interaction. These efforts are careful, measured, and patient. They respect the long histories that each nation carries, while gently encouraging a sense of togetherness. Across Europe, the signs of this shift appear in many forms. Travel becomes easier, more common. Roads and railways stretch across borders, linking cities and regions that once felt distant. People move not only for necessity, but for curiosity, for learning, for connection, for the simple experience of seeing another place. And as they move, they carry with them pieces of their own cultures, blending them softly with others. Cities, especially, begin to reflect this new interconnectedness. They become places where languages mix, where traditions overlap, where the past and present meet in quiet harmony. Old buildings stand beside newer ones. Historic streets carry the footsteps of both memory and change. There is a sense of continuity, but also of openness. In the countryside, life remains grounded, as it has always been. Fields are still tended. Seasons still guide the rhythm of daily life. Yet even here, the influence of a more connected Europe can be felt. Ideas travel farther. Knowledge spreads more easily. The distance between regions feels smaller, not because the land has changed, but because the connections have grown stronger. And within this growing network, Europe begins to take on a new shape. Not a single nation, not a uniform identity, but a collection of distinct places linked by shared purpose. A continent that holds both diversity and unity in a quiet balance. If you imagine once more that gentle view from above, the lines that once divided the land now appear softer, not erased, but less rigid. Between them, countless paths move freely. Roads, railways, rivers, and routes of communication that create a sense of flow across the continent. Movement is constant, yet peaceful. And within this movement, there is a feeling of stability, not the stillness of earlier centuries, but a steady, evolving balance. Europe has changed, from scattered tribes to early kingdoms, from rising empires to quiet medieval worlds, from expansion beyond its shores to transformation within its own lands, and finally, to a place where connection begins to take precedence over division. It is not a final form. It is simply another stage in a long, ongoing story. And as this story continues, it gently leads us toward the present, a Europe shaped by everything that came before, carrying its history not as a burden, but as a quiet foundation, a place where the past and present exist together in calm continuity. Section 13. And now, as we arrive gently at the present moment, Europe rests as a continent shaped not by a single event, but by the slow layering of time itself. Every forest path, every river crossing, every city street carries within it the quiet memory of what came before. The scattered tribes of ancient lands, the early kingdoms finding their place, the rise and soft fading of empires, the calm life within castle walls, the shifting borders, the outward journeys across seas, the steady hum of industry, the forming of nations, and the long, thoughtful return to all connection. All of it remains, not loudly, not urgently, but softly woven into the fabric of the present. Today, Europe feels both familiar and complex. It is a place where modern life moves with quiet efficiency, where trains glide across countries, where cities glow gently at night, where people move between cultures with ease. And yet, beneath this movement, there is a stillness, a sense of depth that comes only from centuries of shared history. You can feel it in the stones of old buildings worn smooth by time. You can sense it in the layout of town that grew slowly, not planned all at once, but shaped by generations. You can hear it, faintly, in the blending of languages, in the rhythm of conversations that carry echoes of the past. Europe today is not one single story. It is many stories, existing side by side. Each nation holds its own identity, its own traditions, its own quiet way of understanding the world. And yet, there is also something that connects them all, a shared awareness of being part of a larger whole. This connection does not erase differences. It allows them to exist in balance. Across the continent, people live their daily lives much as they always have, working, resting, gathering, moving through the gentle cycles of time. The pace may be faster now in some places, quieter in others, but the essence remains. Life continues, and in that continuation there is peace. If you imagine once more drifting above Europe, as we have done throughout this journey, the view is now wide and complete. The continent stretches beneath you, filled with movement, light and quiet patterns of life. Cities shimmer softly. Countryside rests in calm stillness. Roads and rivers connect everything in a steady flow. There are no sharp beginnings or endings, only a continuous unfolding. The borders that once defined so much are now part of a larger picture. They remain, but they no longer carry the same weight. Between them, life moves freely, gently, as it has learned to do over time. And as you take in this view, there is a quiet understanding that Europe was never shaped by a single moment. It was shaped by patience, by slow change, by countless lives lived one day at a time. And in that sense, its story is not so different from any other. It is a story of becoming, of growing, shifting, adapting, and continuing. Now, as this journey comes to a close, allow yourself to rest in that thought. The land has changed and continues to change, but always in its own time, always with a quiet rhythm that carries forward without rush. You have drifted across centuries, through forests and kingdoms, across seas and into cities, witnessing the gentle rise and fall of a continent. And now there is nothing more to follow. Only stillness, only rest. Let the story settle, like soft echoes fading into the distance. And as the quiet of Europe's long history surrounds you, allow your thoughts to slow, your breathing to soften, and your mind to drift gently into sleep.